Okay. Hey guys. It looks like a few people are still going to be streaming in, but I want to be conscientious of time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I see you guys all as attendees. I'll tell you in a second how you can kind of communicate with us. So my name is May Peter Wong. I'm one of the founders of Marcel, along with Ori Gersh, who is a close friend of Mr. Andy Harper here, who will be speaking with us today. This is our first installment of Marcel Talks, where each time, every 2 weeks, we invite an art world expert, whether that's an artist, a gallerist, a collector, or a curator or otherwise, to speak to you guys, the artist community, about a variety of topics. If you have friends who wanted to attend this and couldn't join, we will be making it available in our archive following the completion of the event itself. I'll share that with you guys, and feel free to share it outwards. More importantly, I'm super psyched to be kicking these off with Andy Harper here. He's joining us from West Cornwall in the UK, so it's a little later in the day, right from his studio, which looks out, obnoxiously enough, right onto the beach, which is just a gorgeous place to get to make your work. I think, Andy, you're taking a little bit of you have like a week off this week, right? So you're all in studio just making a ton of work, right?
Yeah.
Amazing. Andy works primarily in painting. I'm not going to go too much in the content of his work, one, because I don't want to speak for what it is. Maybe he will talk a little bit about that, I'm not sure. But more importantly, because he's going to actually be discussing a bit more what it's like to be an artist. He is a man who has a studio in West Cornwall, which is by all intents and purposes a little bit remote as compared to your Londons or your New Yorks. And he might seem somewhat like the lonely artist archetype, but he's going to be speaking a bit about what it means to be an artist and find a community with other artists, how to talk to artists, what you should really be communicating about, and how you guys can find agency as a collection, as opposed to kind of going at it on your own. So I think I've blathered on quite long enough. Andy's going to speak a little bit about this topic here. In the meantime, you guys, as things come up for you, there's a button down at the bottom of the webinar that says Q&A. You can click that and submit questions to me. I believe there may be a way for me to also allow you to speak later on, but for safety's sake, submit anything to me over the Q&A, and following this, we can have an open discussion about anything that arises. So I'm going to mute myself, and Andy, I will give you back host privileges, and feel free to take it away.
Cool. So hopefully everyone can hear me. But yeah, basically, I was invited a couple of weeks ago to think about doing a talk that was in some way sort of linked to professional practice, and I think my first reaction to Ori and May was like, oh, I hate professional practice. It's kind of like one of those things where people give you these rules for successful artists and so on, and I just never quite believe in them. Anyway, having said that, and feeling a bit kind of mean to sort of cut this opportunity off and sort of say, oh no, don't do professional practice. You know, your reality is different to my reality. You know, there's nothing I can say that kind of helps in that way. Not out of a disingenuous, not out of a sort of selfishness or anything. Like, I share a great deal. I teach at Goldsmiths on the MA. And so, you know, I'm constantly sort of sharing, but professional practice is one of those weird ones which, you know, that thing to kind of help people or whatever. But after a couple of days, I suddenly thought there was really, I just had this instance where we were challenged about the leases on the studios that I'm currently in. And it was only a proposal, but it was a rather kind of odd proposal put to us about how long we could stay and how the leases would be renewed or whatever. And it really preoccupied me. And the way we dealt with it, and suddenly I realized more and more of the artists in the other spaces, there are 20 artists in total in this block and another block in a kind of neighboring town. And more and more I realized that everyone sort of felt very similar to me. And so we got together to kind of fight this, or at least sort of show a very common and united front against this kind of proposal, and counter proposed. And it all happened really kind of quickly. And in a way, it was sort of a really great thing to happen in the end. Like loads of people who hadn't spoken for a while were suddenly speaking again and discussing these things that were kind of at stake. And we came together, and suddenly I saw a real kind of power in this acting together, acting as a kind of group. And I suppose previous to this instance, you know, there are some of us who socialize and engage with one another quite a lot. But this was the first time, like, literally everyone was kind of involved. And it just felt really powerful. And I thought, actually, this is something, I mean, not directly this example, but this is something I could kind of talk about here for 10, 15 minutes. Because suddenly I started thinking about all the other times in the last 20, 25 years since I've been out of college, in which I acted together with people or just engaged with people about my work and how useful that was. And what I started to think about was that how, you know, despite, so I'm jumping a bit now, but despite, you know, recent terms being discussed a lot, like the idea of working collectively or collaboratively or socially engaged socially engaged practices and so on. You know, magazines, podcasts are kind of constantly sort of talking about these kind of forms of action. I mean, 2015, Assemble, which is a group of, I think, about 15 architects, artists, designers, were the first collective to win the Turner Prize, for instance. So, you know, it's quite a sort of current contemporary thing, this idea of working collective. But all the kind of talk and kind of coverage that these kind of new, well, they're not new practices, but they're certainly very much spoken about at length at the moment. That this kind of activity sort of, in a way, kind of makes the artist who has chosen to operate like I have, in a kind of orthodox way, in a studio individually, it kind of like pushes us into a position as if like we don't ever talk to anyone, we don't ever socially engage or whatever. And I suddenly realized that, you know, the last 20, 25 years, there have been so many projects, there's so many things that I kind of talk about. If you like, the things I boast about most when I'm sort of talking with others. And it's kind of easier to boast about something that you've done collectively than something you've done individually, or at least I find that, you know, are all these things that I've done collectively. So May mentioned Ori Gerst, who set up Marcel, a project I was involved with him when we first left college, was setting up a darkroom and a collection of studios, like a sort of artist-run studio block, which we ran for about 14 years in London. And you know, I often we were called Not Cut Studios, and the idea was we were leaving education and, you know, all the support system that education gives you, all the workshops and so on. And Ori was based mostly in photography and also touching into video at that time. And I was based in painting, but I was also quite kind of manually, I could kind of construct walls and things for studios. And then we also had another photographer who had great connections with kind of legal side of things and so on. Anyway, we set this studio up with the idea that we all had tools, both physical tools. I had a couple of cordless drills. Ori and Rob bought a kind of second-hand photography lab equipment and so on. And so the idea is that we would pool our resources and real tools, physical tools, to sort of so that the sort of drop off from art school, you know, after graduating, we were all at the Royal College doing the MA there, that wouldn't be such this sort of falling off a precipice of kind of like, you know, just suddenly that support system wasn't around you. And another thing that's really key here is also, and one of the main things we did with those studios is that all the studios in London at that time all had individual doors and locks, and you kind of closed yourself behind this door you shut the door and you were in there. And there was one called Great Western Studios, which was in West London. And it was just corridors and corridors, hundreds of studios. And there were just these doors. So you had no idea who was behind them or whatever. Well, we made this conscious decision to make sure that all the spaces had one open side. So there were no doors and no kind of barriers. Like people were kind of, they had their personal space that they needed to make their kind of things, but there was a sort of sense of openness and exchange. And this is just one example of kind of many that I thought of that was sort of super important to sort of counteract this idea that the artist sort of acts so alone. From whichever way you look at it, it's always kind of promoted as this, if the artist is an individual artist and it's a single name, you think about press releases, accompanying information for exhibitions of artists or whatever. It's always kind of literally like it's sort of coming from this kind of really single voice, and if there's anyone else, let's say they talk about in a press release, when you go to a solo show of someone, they might talk about an influence. That influence will always be someone kind of like of a higher ranking. Like this person was heavily influenced by mine's gone blank, of a kind of big artist who kind of I didn't want to go as big as Picasso, but I didn't want to but I wanted it to sort of make sense in relation to, so there's this sort of idea that of course it's okay to associate this artist with someone at a much higher level, and that influence would be fine. But you'd never read in a press release, and he has a coffee break every day at 11 o'clock and talks to his mates about his work. It's like it's never kind of on that level. That's never sin. So I think we sort of forget it. And in my studio here, I mean, I'm still the person who makes the best coffee in the studios. And so lo and behold, there's at least 2 people in here every 10:30 every morning. And sometimes we don't chat about work. I mean, hey, we're multifaceted humans. So sometimes we might refer to something that's on the wall, and sometimes we might refer to or talk about something related to being an artist, the art world, whatever that entails, everything and anything. But generally it's just this kind of chat that kind of happens. And that, I just feel like that needs kind of stating. And it's, for so many of you, probably is stating the complete obvious. But for someone who finds initiating those things kind of difficult, I've never regretted it. So, I mean, another example is, after setting the studio up, we all kind of spoke with one another, but those people became quite close friends. And there was something interesting about when we became kind of much closer friends, the rawness of which we would talk about one another's work wasn't so hard hitting. And so it was interesting, about 10 years after graduating, I set up a forum. I got a little bit of funding from a funding board called ArtQuest in London. And my proposal for setting up this forum was that I would pick people that I knew of. I knew their work, or, sort of knew the friend of a friend or whatever, but that had never spoken to them about work. And so I set up a kind of series of 6 seminars where 2 of us, there were 12 in the whole group, but 2 of us each week, we did it every fortnight or so, every 2 weeks, would present a kind of an idea that ran parallel and motivated our practice. So it wasn't quite just present your work, but I remember setting this up. And I must say, I didn't set this up on my own. I set this up with my partner at the time, my girlfriend, who is now my wife. And again, I'm not sure I'd have had the kind of confidence to sort of completely do this on my own. But the pair of us kind of organized it. We had food at the event. We had resources we could use, kind of certain rooms in universities. She was teaching in Chelsea. I was teaching at 2 other colleges that we could sometimes kind of use the equipment. But, it was a real sort of like, am I really going to do this and put myself in this kind of arena? But I absolutely never regretted it. And like, out of those 12 people, 5 or 6 of them are still, long-term friends, people I stay in contact with about their work and so on. So it's just that sort of pushing out there and then kind of speaking about work. And and so maybe this is enough examples now, and others will come up when we start to talk. But so it's just this idea of trying to dispel the notion that there is just this sort of single person kind of working away in a studio, completely isolated. And as I say, I've tried or thought about working with assistants and collaboratively, even tried to work with my partner collaboratively, and it just doesn't suit my sense of making. But that doesn't mean I don't need so much kind of help, support, and basically social exchange around me, in order just to avoid madness. I mean, if you try to sort of actually idealize that kind of idea of working kind of completely on your own, it actually, doesn't lead to creativity. It leads to kind of madness. In fact, perhaps the last example I use is I was recently on a residency in San Diego, and it was a wonderful residency, amazingly sort of generous in relation to space, facilities, and time. I mean, amazing, just absolutely fantastic. But it had one problem, and that was the director, the then director. I'm not going to mention any names here, but the then director had a very strange and romanticized idea of a sort of artist working in a tower, kind of alone, like with their own thoughts, undistracted by the world. So after a week, I was going stir crazy. I mean, it was like a sort of museum show that you sort of had in previous work. And then you had a month sort of inside the museum, like a kind of studio, to make work and I had the keys to the place and the alarm system and so on. I just literally had the run of the whole place, and an amazing apartment. I mean, the added bonus of being 8 minutes away from one of the best reef breaks in California, but that's beside the point. I surf. But this sort of romanticized idea of having no distractions and hence therefore no contact. There was something like 12, 13, 14 members of staff working in this institution. And I later found out that the staff were not meant to interrupt me or disturb me or disrupt me. And it suddenly made sense why one of the guys who was a surfer as well, when I said, we should go surfing together, he sort of slightly backed off, and I didn't know why. And I realized they'd been kind of instructed to basically, leave the artist alone, let her concentrate whilst they're here. And of course, in the end I did make loads of work, but I made it by kind of really reaching out to people. Weirdly, one of the best friends from that became someone I met in the surf who, didn't hold me under this kind of individuated, kind of like isolated bubble that I was sort of meant to be in. So that's a kind of like bad story, or not a bad story, the kind of negative side of this non-interaction. So, but maybe other examples will come up, and maybe I've spoke long enough to sort of open that up into a conversation. That if any questions or whatever, and I'll talk about the other examples, as they come up. Are you there, May?
I am. I was just trying to get my video back on. That was awesome. So anybody who's attending now, you should either be able to press that Q&A button at the bottom to submit any questions for Andy, or there's a raise your hand option, which I believe will allow you to actually pose such a question. Oh, I just saw a hand pop up, so we'll check that in a second. Andy, one question that came up for me in hearing you speak, you have had the benefit of being involved in some ways in sort of pre-generated communities, right? A residency has embedded in it other artists, the director of the program. School obviously has embedded in it other artists who you generate some social affinity to. Have you ever had an experience where you're kind of completely separate from an existing art community and have been required to proactively pave those pathways? I only say that because a number of our users have expressed difficulty in finding people like them because they live either in rural areas or they don't have an art academic background that kind of allows them those initial social pathways. So wondering if you have any suggestions or if going to art school is kind of the right initial direction.
Yeah, no. So, I mean, in a way, what I was trying to stress with that last example of this residency that I did in San Diego is that although there was a community there, they were kind of instructed to sort of only deal with me in exactly how they needed to carry out their business. So, and it wasn't until later that I realized some of them had been to art school, so they didn't even approach me as artists. So that was one time, and my strategy was to sort of circumnavigate it. So when there were social events that happened in this organization, because there was a lot kind of going on there, I luckily hooked up with the kind of audience, and it wasn't artists. It was actually just an incredibly kind anti-nuclear activist who kind of took me under his wing and kind of held like a kind of barbecue in his garden a couple of miles down the road with all sorts of unusual and interesting people from kind of loads of different disciplines. So I was saved a little bit by him. And then I was also saved by the fact that I was surfing. And I mean, it's kind of classic that I tried to hide that I was a surfer because they might have worked out why I was coming to San Diego for a residency. But, you know, once I arrived and I sort of pulled my boards out of the car or whatever, they were like, right, okay. So, but actually it was in the surf that I made friends by pure chance with the guy who literally ran a school next door. And he said to me, hey, you know, you're an artist, you're in town, why don't you come and talk to our students? And I was like, yeah, great. You know, like, so I went down there and I invited them up to the studio and so on. So again, I had to be pretty proactive. And, but there's nothing better than something like surfing where you're being very physical in the water and the sort of, you're fairly ecstatic to be sort of outdoors, exercising in the sea, you know, well, I am, especially in wintertime in California. So, you know, I did reach out in those, but I suppose in relation to this idea of being isolated, I'm trying to also think if I relied heavily or started to rely more heavily on sort of digital connections. So I'm pretty sure I probably wrote much longer emails to people, you know, talking through certain things. The internet, which was another problem. The internet there was really terrible. So weirdly, Skype was not working as I'd wished. So, you know, if I tried to sort of think about how I could talk to my wife and my kids and stuff back home and talk to them and show them what I was doing the work, but the Wi-Fi did not work well enough in the space to show them my work and Skype. So that was kind of all frustrating. But so I'm kind of curious on if anyone else has got examples of like the digital Skype. I mean, I haven't investigated Skype well enough to do sort of like conference calls, but there's this forum I was talking about. There's nothing to stop people kind of using Skype, but, you know, to get like multi people kind of joining or similar like Zoom, similar kind of platforms. I don't see why that wouldn't work. And I think actually in thinking about doing this, I thought, that it's kind of like raised a little sort of idea in my head. I just wanted to go back also. There was another point I wanted to make about, we mentioned education. It wasn't a direct question about education. But I was taught at the Royal College of Art in London, and I now teach at Goldsmiths in London. And the educational model between the two places is very different. And I think this is also why I think about this quite a lot. So as one example, and when I'm talking about the Royal College, I'm talking about the Royal College in the 1990s. I think it's changed somewhat, but I don't think completely. I think that Goldsmiths and Royal College, both very good colleges, but I think they both operate in a different way. So to sort of typify how the Royal College works is you have a kind of series of tutors that they're not called masters. In fact, in the UK, we don't even call our teachers professors as you might in the US. but they're lecturers, but they are seen a bit like there's a sort of pyramid kind of structure where, you know, they are seen to be the ones kind of handing down knowledge and experience. In Goldsmiths, we work much more by sort of facilitating, and we treat our kind of students like already artists, and and there's much more peer-to-peer learning. And I think these two quite distinct models really have an effect on how you operate after college. So what happens in Goldsmiths is that you're within a group and you meet once a week in relation to a seminar, hence me talking about setting up this forum. It's a very similar sort of structure that I set up for myself, is that people within those groups start to rely on those groups even when they've graduated. They get so kind of close. So one example is a group tutorial at Goldsmiths means 4 students and 1 tutor facilitating. A group tutorial that I had in the 1990s in the Royal College was 4 members of staff, 4 lecturers, and me, and that's it. And so that difference, I think, is really, it's. I mean, I went to the Royal College and I had a great time there, and it was very good for me. But I much prefer educationally the format, the underlying structure of somewhere like Goldsmiths, where I now teach. I think it's so much healthier. And in fact, it was brought home to me when recently Peter Doig, many of you might know, like one of the sort of most kind of successful painters alive today, he came to Cornwall, and he came with Matthew Higgs, which some of you might know as someone who set up White Columns in New York. And I didn't know this. So Peter Doig actually taught me at the Royal College. And hugely successful, you know, he was Toner Prize shortlist, John Moore's, you know, shows all over the world. And he set up Tramps with Matthew Higgs. And it was only by going to this talk about a year ago that I suddenly realized that Matthew Higgs and Peter Doig are peer group. It's not like, you know, Matthew Higgs was this kind of all-powerful kind of curator. You know, he's often employed to talk about the kind of, he's often asked to sort of say who are the next big things in the art world for Art Review or whatever, you know, and so on. He's a very influential curator. And so there was me sort of thinking, oh yeah, influential curator, you know, but Peter Doig and Matthew Higgs are a very similar age. They were at college together. They kind of were mates together. They kind of, you know, it's not like someone from the top was handing down this kind of power, which is often how it kind of seems from the outside. Like, you know, how do you get to talk to this dealer, that curator, the director of this museum, whatever. It's like, it just doesn't, in my experience, work like that. And so that's why I think it's also really important to sort of stay connected to the people you graduate with and anyone else who you kind of come in contact with, because they're your peer group that you grow up with and kind of enter the world with. And this was the other kind of point, or the kind of structure that I was really keen to sort of talk about. Because I think when you talk about professional practice, everyone's a bit like, how do you get your work seen? How do you get it into the eye of galleries? How do you, and so on. And I think actually they're the wrong questions. It's how you utilize the people around you. And I don't mean in any sort of cynical way, you know, but, you know, this is your peer group. And the Goldsmith system that I was talking about earlier encourages an independence within the students, you know, in a way. I don't want to downplay my role as kind of teaching there, but, you know, I'm there just to facilitate them to network between themselves, as opposed to sort of hand down any kind of like knowledge or wise words or whatever. And yeah, so wow, sorry, I've talked for too long again.
No, I think that's it. I mean, I'm struck by your point about Doig, and I think people generally have a misconception about the art world that there's one person with a magic wand who's anointing the successful artists and failing all of the other ones. And 80% of the time what happens is, you know, somebody that you went to school with, or somebody that you shared a studio with at some point, who says you should meet this interesting curator. You're out at drinks or at a bar. It's a social engagement that
Yeah.
that initial connection or that networking opportunity, I guess, in business parlance. Okay, so let's see here. We got a couple questions in the Q&A. It sounds like everyone's a little shy about raising their hand and actually saying it verbally. Okay, so this is kind of to your earlier point. How do I conduct a studio visit with another artist and be open to hearing their feedback? I actually get more nervous talking to another artist than someone who might buy my artwork.
That's interesting. So, I mean, I wonder where this nervousness comes from, and I understand it. I completely understand it. But I think it's also trying to sort of switch off this idea that the work is you. Okay, so because we work on our own, like if we're talking about the orthodox artists in a studio working on their own or whatever, and then like showing it to people or inviting people in or whatever, if we're talking about that situation, then you spend a lot of time with this kind of on your own, and it's really difficult to sort of separate the work from yourself. But you must do this in order to be able to kind of hear criticism and see it as being useful. I won't deny that sometimes at Goldsmiths, the Goldsmiths system, if you like, suits certain people and not others. And in fact, what's interesting, when I went to college, I was very young. And if I'd have gone to Goldsmiths, it would have destroyed me, because I would have taken it personally and I would have found it incredibly difficult to find it like constructive criticism. So you've got to embrace the idea that this person, by saying this, there has to be a mutual trust. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the person who's kind of saying this is only saying this to try and help you. And it's their reading of the work that if they see a problem that might upset you, they're only trying to kind of point this out, that other people might see this as well. So the reason why, the way you could set it up so that there's kind of mutual trust is that this forum that I set up, there were 12 people in it, and all 12 people were going to present. So, there is a certain sort of understanding of exchange that I have to, it's not about behaving or anything, but there has to be a kind of respect that, you input constructively, because you're going to want as constructive back when you show your work or when you present your ideas. So I think there has to be this kind of parity in the sense of going to certain studio, and there are examples where it hasn't worked. So I've been to someone's studio across 6-7 miles away, and I went there first, and I think I probably was a bit harsh, and I was as harsh as I would want someone to be with me. But I think this person wasn't really up for kind of talking on that kind of level, and so they never came back to my studio. So this failed, So for sure, I'm not saying I'm brilliant at this and I can always make it kind of work and constructive for all parties concerned. But so in a way, to get over that nervousness, there's two things. One, there has to be a sort of reciprocal notion that, it's two-way. And then I think there's a sort of mutual respect. And secondly, although I said this first, secondly, you need to detach this idea of the personal. This is an object that you might have made and stroked into being with all the love and care that you could muster, but it is not you. Okay, it's still an object that is to be read semiotically, if you like, a system of kind of signs and a language that's within now a kind of context of art. And so you have to detach yourself from that. And the person who is constructing, hopefully, if they're generous enough, is only doing it to point out, before this thing gets to show or whatever, if there's something like really sticking out in this work, it can be so kind of useful and helpful. Yeah, and talking to lots of people, just, it's like, how are you read? How does the work read? It's incredibly hard to determine how the sort of attitude of your work, and you can only kind of gain that, or the how your work is read, and you can only gain that by showing it to lots of people. And that, you know, the person who's nervous is for sure. I'm nervous every time I kind of do it. Like it's a tricky thing. You know, I used to have a tutor in Brighton who used to sort of find their studio for 3 weeks after someone had visited. They used to find their studio like it was like dirty and sullied by this visitor. And it's like, whoa, you know, how did you get over that one? But so we all have it. We'll have this kind of nervousness. Yeah, I do it by having people in my space quite a lot. So as I say, you know, 5 times a week, 2 friends, Simon and Sam, they're in here having coffee, you know. So, and I think they think it doesn't affect me at all to do that. But I do it quite purposely in order to sort of just break down this idea that this is my space. Get out, you know, don't say anything rude, you know, or whatever. It's you know. And I think that's why I talked about this as well, because this is not something I find uber natural to do myself, but I always come out of it thinking that was a really good thing to do. Even like agreeing to do this webinar, right? Like I was like, today I was like, have I got enough to talk about? You know, and so on. And so yeah, it's just to sort of push people to do that. Like you won't regret it.
I'm shocked to hear that you have people in your studio 5 days a week. That's quite frequent. But I see your general point that you want to be able to trust those people as providing valuable feedback, and that they would expect that same reciprocity from you in their space, and that it's not attacking nor is it frivolous. And B, that you just have to do it often, right? And the more you do something over and over, the more comfortable you're going to get with it. So I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Here's another one. It's a little bit more generic, but it touches on, I mean, my surprise about your schedule. Can you describe what your day-to-day is like? Like how much time do you actually spend making artwork? How much do you actually just spend time in the waves? Do you spend any real time on art business stuff, or is that kind of the stuff that you leave in the background?
Yeah, I mean, it fluctuates. I was just filling something in recently, sort of talking about this, and I wish I could tell you, you know, I had this really strict regime, and I was so disciplined, and you know, on Mondays I do this, and on Tuesdays I do that. But effectively, you know, I'm a dad of 2 children. I have a wife who's an incredibly successful artist herself, and recently she's just been traveling, like to many parts of the world. So I've solely been kind of in charge of the children. So, you know, on a day I have the kids, and even if they go to school, my day in here is quite short. So one is I like routine, and if I can build it in for the next couple of weeks, fantastic. And the reason why at the moment I am literally in the studio 24 hours a day, I'm sleeping here or whatever, is because I've had this kind of run where my son had chicken pox as well. So, you know, I had to kind of deal with that and so on. So lots of disruptions, lots of kind of other kind of life stuff kind of getting in the way. And I'm a terrible procrastinator. So I must have rearranged my shelves in my studio probably 30 times. And I've only been here like 5 years or something. And I only say this so that hopefully half of you can think, oh, it's okay to procrastinate. But, you know, if a text can come in, or yesterday I got emailed by someone I deal with in London, a gallery I deal with in London. And that was total, you know, arts admin-y stuff. It was invoicing. It was checking inventory. You know, he was saying he had titles that were different. Anyway, it was just... And I spent the whole day on that. I don't worry about it. Like, so yesterday I did pick up a paintbrush and I was doing some drawings, but, you know, I think the majority of my day yesterday was sort of dealing with this email, but it had to be done. So I couldn't tell you proportionally. I'm lucky in the sense that when I do work, I work pretty quickly. So, if my house and everything that I kind of make in my house, like DIY wise, is always sort of done like not very well finished, but kind of done efficiently. And so I can make and do something. If I decide in the morning that we need a bench, you know, in the afternoon we've got a bench or something, it's like I just get on and do it. So my work used to be much more time consuming, and now it sort of happens quite quickly, but I have to find the right kind of mood in which to do it. And I work on how relaxed about that I am all the time. So of course I'm beating myself up saying, oh God, I was in the studio 6 hours and all I did was look on eBay for a different kind of scraper or something. It's so, and then I go home and I think, well, maybe that was important, to see what kind of scrapers are available. So how long, there was another part of this question which I'm trying to retract, but yeah, so it's kind of very varied, and I'm resigning myself to just being as comfortable with that as possible. But I'm someone who has to write lists and try and tick them off. And my reminders on my phone is like, and that's sometimes if I just know something's got to get done. I don't know if anyone's heard of the policy of eat the frog, which is this idea that you always write a list and you eat the frog first. You do the sort of thing you least want to do. I do have this sort of, so I often do that. If I just feel like I'm not being productive enough, then I'll start to write some lists and eat the frogs. Yeah. So, but it kind of really, there's, I mean, if I'm teaching, then obviously I have to be at work in London, which breaks the week up. And of course I have to be there set hours that are predetermined and so on. So it's not like there's no structure to my life. And I have to be back at 3 o'clock for the kids when they come home from school or whatever. But so it's not like there is a structure. But in relation to studio time, I'm someone who quite likes to clear everything out of the way before I can start making work. But I still probably make 50 pieces of work a year. So I'm not worried. Like it's, when it happens quite quickly.
I feel like I just made you a little bit nervous unnecessarily. You're like, I think I make at least 50 artworks a year, right? So that's okay. That's fine, right?
Yeah. I'm only on about 5 so far this year, so I'm a bit behind, but yeah.
I think you'll catch up. Interesting to know that the frogs you choose to eat first are reorganizing your shelves. So I think we have time for one more question. It's a little bit generic again, but I think a lot of the artists in this group today are more on the emerging set. So what advice do you have for emerging artists on how to be quote unquote successful? And Andy, here I would use your definition of success, which is probably likely not commercial success and all these other kind of things. What's the thing that's driven you over the course of the last 25 years to get you to a place where you're happy?
I think that if you are, like me, a kind of studio-based practitioner, then, I mean, this can apply to any practitioner, but let's just talk about it in relation to working within a kind of studio or at home or wherever. But what really matters at the end of the day, this is going to seem flaky, but I really believe this. And what really matters is that you are happy making what you are making most of the time, and that you're happy in your studio. The art business, selling, lecturing, all these other activities that you might have to do, I think are subsidiary to, I mean, I really enjoy teaching, so maybe I shouldn't bring that example, but all this other kind of admin, selling, other successful kind of things, you only do that for a small percentage of your time. So, you're in the studio making work most of the time. So that's where you have to be happy. And that's why I sort of also hate this idea of a lone artist kind of tortured and isolated, as if like I have to have a sort of mental health issue in order to sort of make good work. I mean, I find this really spurious and really problematic. Dangerous as well. Like, this is what's really important. I mean, I have some commercial success in the sense that I could live off just making work, which I think is a massive privilege and I'm incredibly grateful for. But I still, I don't think this brings me as much happiness as I probably thought on the other side of it, like 20, 25 years ago. The main thing is that you feel comfortable with what you're kind of making. And I think this also plays into kind of sharing what you're making by having people visit and show work. But let's just open that up. I mean, that's why if you're not studio practice, it still applies. Are you happy in kind of engaging in the way, even if you work just on your laptop, is that something you enjoy spending doing? And I think if it is, and you start making kind of good and interesting work, then you'll find that the art world is actually quite a generous place. I think we all sort of get a bit kind of gripey and annoyed with the kind of art world, whatever that kind of might mean, or frustrated with it. But actually, if you're comfortable with what you're making and you kind of believe in it and you start getting people on your side, it starts to become a pretty generous and interesting kind of environment to kind of work. So, I think that's the kind of key thing. When people are finishing their MA, especially when they start coming up to their degree show, one of the things I often say to people, they're trying to think about making the best show, and they're kind of like heads are like all over the place with the possibilities of what would be the best degree show. And my one piece of advice at that stage, when they're kind of really confused, is that it's really important that they have a show that is a springboard for what happens afterwards. There's no good in having a show which they think would look brilliant, be spectacular, and get loads of attention if they don't feel comfortable in kind of making and following that out. Like what's really important is that at that first point of sort of public airing or first kind of point of exposing yourself is not really where your ideas kind of lie. Then you're in trouble, because obviously that's what everyone's going to kind of go on. So yeah, and in a way, so that's success for me. I mean, I've had periods where I've done really well commercially and then it's dropped off, and then done really well commercially and then I dropped off. But my happiness has not been affected by this kind of up and down. It's kind of immaterial. It's always more about whether I'm excited, surprised, and kind of intrigued by the things that I'm making. Like, they have a kind of uncanny nature, which kind of is both really knowable, but also sort of slightly out of grasp. I'm like, what is it about this thing? There's yeah.
So I think maybe to summarize a little bit, success to you is finding an artistic practice that invigorates you in the studio, makes you happy, makes you a little bit curious, a little bit unfulfilled, because you want to find out more. And the validation that you might seek outside of your own personal headspace and your own actual making process is the validation and the criticism or feedback from other artists. We should focus less on getting that validation from that master curator or that collector or that gallerist, because those things can come naturally if you believe in what you're doing and are validated by other artists around you.
Yeah, by whoever you see, your peer group, that kind of validation. And that counts for kind of much more.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, you also opened up a can of worms about building a narrative in your artistic path, which I think is maybe a topic for another time. But Andy, I want to thank you for your time and all of your experience and awesome words. And to our attendees, our shy attendees, thank you for joining. I'll be sharing this link outwardly with everybody else. And have a good one, Andy.
Yeah, I'm gonna hit the surf. Look at the sun now. Look, it's blinding.
Unbelievable.
There's people out there surfing, so I'm gonna get wetsuited up.
Go enjoy it. All right. Thanks so much, everybody.
Take care. Cheers. Thank you.